A very good afternoon to all of you, or good morning, good evening, whichever part of the world you are. Welcome to the 8th Counterpoint Southeast Asia Public Seminar, organized by the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. My name is Melly Anthony. I am with the RSIS Nanyang Technological University, and I am delighted to be the guest moderator for today's webinar. The Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a webinar and public brief series that examines strategic and complex issues facing Southeast Asia by presenting the perspectives of regional academics and policy experts. Today's topic is, I think, of great interest to you all because it asks the question, is ASEAN centrality obsolete in an evolving regional order? Just by way of setting the stage, we all know that for some time, ASEAN has been feted as the fulcrum of regional institutions in Asia. And the ASEAN centrality has been a subject of intense interest to academic and policy communities within and outside the region. But much has changed since the early 2000s when the centrality was very much a buzzword. Now, ASEAN faces several serious challenges. Amongst this include the growing or heightening US-China competition, China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea, the emergence of regional security frameworks like QUAD and the AUKUS, and closer to home, ASEAN faces the very difficult challenge of trying to deal with the political crisis in Myanmar. This has, of course, not only dented ASEAN's credibility, but has also risked growing division and bifurcation in the region, testing the ability of ASEAN to respond collectively to maintain regional peace and security. So this webinar answers a number of questions, which includes, can ASEAN effectively respond while maintaining its unity to these challenges? And will ASEAN be able to navigate the Sino-US rivalry while preserving so-called strategic autonomy? And can ASEAN remain relevant while preventing becoming obsolete in an evolving regional order? To answer this question, this overarching question, we are joined by three experts. Let me first introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rizal Sukma, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Jakarta. Previously, he was Indonesia's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organization from 2016 to 2020. For those who follow ASEAN affairs very closely, Dr. Rizal has been is famous for penning the ASEAN Security Community blueprint. Our second speaker is Dr. Sarah Teo, who is assistant professor in the Regional Security Architecture Program at the RSIS Nanyang Technological University. Her research interests include multilateral security and defense cooperation in ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific, middle powers in the Asia-Pacific, as well as power in international relations. And our third speaker is Ms. Motu Zah, who is a senior fellow at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, where she coordinates the Myanmar Studies Program. Without further ado, let me now invite our speakers, starting with Dr. Rizal. You will have about 5 to 7 minutes highlighting your key points. We will have enough time later to come back to some of the points which you may not have been able to express fully during the Q&A session. So over to you, Rizal, please.
Well, thank you so much, Melly, and good afternoon to all other speakers and also all the participants, who follow this discussion. So I think this, issue of questioning or the the questionings of the ASEAN centrality, whether it's still relevant, whether it's still it's already obsolete or not, actually started as soon as the terms actually included in the ASEAN Charter back in 2008, and then since then I think we all, the analysts, the practitioners, and also the academics already use a number of adjectives to describe this ASEAN centrality. Somebody used the term "is a myth." Others, would say there's illusion. Others even say, it's a fantasy, and so on. But, I think the fact that until today we're still, having this debate on the very concept of centrality also suggests that no matter how you describe it, this concept, still around. So that's, I think, one very interesting fact. So coming back to the question that, Melly posed, is ASEAN centrality obsolete in the face of the evolving regional architecture? That's completely, a different angle, to the questions, because, number one, I mean, if you're interested, you can read Melly's very, I think, excellent exposition of what centrality means, in a journal article, which, I think, one of the meaning that, Melly tried to argue is that it is about the place of ASEAN within, the regional architecture beyond Southeast Asia. So, if we use that understanding, then of course, ASEAN was and is central, so we, in that context. So you find ASEAN everywhere, in the Asia-Pacific. In fact, in the article, there is this beautiful, I think, visualization of ASEAN centrality, within all this web of regional institutions that's actually, I think, is provided by, ASEAN or ASEAN centrality in that, in that context. However, if we only look at the place of ASEAN within the regional architecture, so it tends to be, it's quite descriptive and static. So it doesn't give you a very convincing answer, regarding to the question what ASEAN wants to do by being at the center. What purpose, does ASEAN or does that position serve? So we still, I think, struggling, to find that question. So in short, basically, yes, ASEAN is at the center in terms of place within this regional architecture. So what? So it's basically my first point. That will bring me to the second dimension of this centrality, or the meaning of centrality, which is the ability of ASEAN to do things, to achieve its goals. And then if that is the meaning that you want to focus on, then you have a very mixed answer. In some areas, probably, easy to say that, yes, ASEAN is still, I think, relevant, but in other areas, no, it's already, obsolete and need to change. So it's really depending on what sort of task or objective that you want to focus in order, to make an assessment. Then you will arrive with the answer, to that question whether ASEAN, is obsolete within the evolving regional architecture, or not. So, within that context, I think in order to really go into a bit detail about the answer, to whether ASEAN is obsolete or not, then, we need to look at least, 3 dimensions. Number one, on the evolving regional order itself. So, when we talk about this order, it means the transitional order that characterized by great power rivalry, quest for influence, tension, disputes, an emerging Indo-Pacific order where both competition and cooperations are also taking place. So I think that's the first context that we really need to unpack if we really want to make an assessment. Within that evolving regional order, then the questions, of course, what are the ASEAN strategic interests are? So what ASEAN wants? Can ASEAN shape and influence that order? Does ASEAN matter, in that process? So we know for sure that from at least the latest document, the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, that ASEAN does not doesn't want to choose between the US and China, doesn't want to become an arena for rivalry, doesn't want to get dragged into the proxy conflict, of this geopolitical rivalry. And ASEAN wants to do at least 4 things. Number one, to retain its autonomy. to shape regional economic and security architecture, uphold the rules-based regional architecture, and also be an honest broker within the strategic environment of competing, interests among the great powers. So the third dimension, of this assessment, then I think centrality can be preserved only if ASEAN can achieve those objectives. So of course the question is that can ASEAN really achieve those objectives that is already stated, in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Let go very quickly. The first one on not to choose. So I think it is increasingly difficult, to maintain a non-aligned position of ASEAN and ASEAN member state. ASEAN might have, to choose. I don't know when, but I think these are the challenges that many analysts, began to, point out, to the future challenges that we face. The ASEAN member state becomes more and more difficult, in positioning itself on the spectrum of deference and defiance vis-a-vis the great powers. So I don't think that ASEAN can achieve that. I don't think ASEAN has the ability, to actually do that. Number two, on shaping regional architecture. Well, Melly already mentioned, all these, AUKUS, and all other minilateralism and all other initiatives taken by extra-regional powers. So it really, really poses a threat, to the ASEAN marginalization, the erosions of autonomy, and also much reduced agency of the ASEAN member state. The third one is ASEAN wants to be an honest broker. Come on, ASEAN does not even say anything, to what happened in the Ayungin show. ASEAN has not even, mentioned it, not even calling for restraint, not even call for calm. So in fact, here, one of the ASEAN member states, probably I would not blame anyone in Philippines if they start thinking like what we have been thinking in Jakarta as well. Why should we be in ASEAN if it doesn't really bring any added value, to member state? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very candid perspective, results. So when ASEAN doesn't serve the interests and the purpose of its member state, then why should member state stay with ASEAN? Oh, that's something we can reflect on or we can discuss later on. But let me now invite Sarah. Sarah, for your take on whether ASEAN centrality is already obsolete. Sarah, please.
Thanks very much, Melly. And I want to thank Dennis and the Center on Asia and Globalization as well for the invitation to be part of this panel. So very good afternoon to my fellow panelists and to everyone else. So is ASEAN centrality obsolete in an evolving regional order? So my short answer is really, as it stands, I think ASEAN centrality is not completely obsolete. I think ASEAN centrality does retain some of its value, but in the longer term, I see that consistent efforts are really required to preserve that centrality. So the phrase ASEAN centrality, I think typically we make it in reference to the grouping's place in the driver's seat of regional multilateralism, right, and its engagement with dialogue partners. So I think it is a role that ASEAN has sought for itself post-Cold War, and one that external partners have been willing to accommodate and agree to, as long as, and this is fairly important, as long as it doesn't clash or it doesn't undermine their own interests. And I think we are all familiar with, the period during the late 90s to the early 10s, when, in my view, I think ASEAN was institutionally at its peak during this time, right? Because not only did it expand, it also launched broader regional groupings such as the ASEAN +3, the East Asia Summit, and the ADMM+. So ASEAN's convening and agenda-setting roles for those forums, I think, certainly boosted its much vaunted centrality at the time. So in recent years, as we know, ASEAN centrality has come under increasing pressure, right? This is a result of several developments. One is, of course, the deepening China-US rivalry, alongside the establishment of non-ASEAN-led, more exclusive networks. And then, of course, other long-standing developments such as the slow progress on the South China Sea negotiations, as well as, I think, the periodic absences of high-level US representation at ASEAN meetings, they collectively add to this pessimistic outlook for ASEAN. And of course, fractures among ASEAN member states have also raised questions about ASEAN cohesion. But despite these challenges, I think that ASEAN does continue to offer some value to regional stakeholders. And I think that the benefits of ASEAN's convening role, right, all the benefits that were talked about in the past, that it helps to facilitate meetings on the sidelines, that it creates or it establishes this conducive space for countries to engage multilaterally despite bilateral tensions or disputes. I think those benefits have not disappeared, right? They still exist. And the recognition of that value, I think, is demonstrated to some extent by events like perhaps the UK's application to be ASEAN's latest dialogue partner, the interest of some extra-regional countries to become observers to the activities of the EDMM+. The developments surrounding the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, I think provide another example. And fundamentally, the AOIP, I think, could be read as a reaction to two interrelated developments, right? So one would be the various Indo-Pacific narratives and strategies that were being put forward by the non-ASEAN countries. And the second would be Beijing's censures towards what it saw as a containment of its rise. So amid fears of potential exclusion in the regional order, right? So both the exclusion of ASEAN itself as well as the exclusion of some of its dialogue partners, ASEAN issued the AOIP. So with that emphasis on inclusivity of ASEAN platforms in the AOIP, I think that document is an attempt by ASEAN to reclaim its centrality in the region. And the reception to the AOIP thus far indicates a key advantage that ASEAN continues to possess over other regional actors. Specifically, that it offers really the most acceptable and I think least controversial choice for multilateral engagement and cooperation vis-a-vis the competing powers. And the AOIP has also provided a convenient option for countries seeking to navigate between China and the US with their own Indo-Pacific strategies, right? So aligning all these different Indo-Pacific strategies with the AOIP does help to blunt a bit of the divisive connotations that surround this newer regional construct. So I think this is something that so far only ASEAN can provide. Sure, I think the AOIP does have its shortcomings, right, as several others have pointed out. But even with all those flaws, the AOIP actually highlights ASEAN's value proposition, right, or ASEAN's unique selling point, if you will, which is that its initiatives are still able to garner buy-in across the various regional stakeholders. And that ASEAN is the only regional multilateral convener acceptable to all at this stage. So there exists, I think, a fair number of criticisms that these are more symbolic than substantive. And while we certainly should not read these actions or these commitments at face value, I think it is also useful to keep in mind that the strength of ASEAN centrality ultimately is really a reflection of the negotiations and the compromises involving different interests, not just among ASEAN member states, but also between ASEAN and its external partners. So in that sense, managing the expectations of what ASEAN centrality is and what it can really achieve would be an important task. There would also be a need, I think, to ensure that ASEAN's long-standing value continues to remain visible and acknowledged, right? Even amid all the changes in geopolitical dynamics and in the regional order. So it is not that ASEAN centrality has become completely irrelevant, but more that I think it will require efforts to upkeep in the longer term. So I will stop here. Thank you. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I like what you said about ASEAN's value proposition, that whatever else you say about its challenges and its weakness, everyone still wants to be part of what ASEAN is doing. And you talked about, the initiative by the UK to be one of ASEAN's dialogue partners. And it reminds me of when they were talking about the East Asia Summit, that it's always good for other parties to be in the tent that ASEAN has built. So we will come back to this being part and being the the main mover in organizing or in setting up regional institutions. And that's really why they talked about ASEAN being in the driver's seat, part of the centrality definition. And now we turn to Mo. We would be interested to find out, Mo, your insights on this, particularly since you are dealing with a very difficult issue that ASEAN is now facing, and that is the crisis in Myanmar. So over to you, Mo, please.
Thank you, Melly. At the outset, I'd also like to join Pak Rizal and Sarah in thanking you, Dennis, and the LKY School for Public Policy for putting together this very interesting panel and inviting us to share our thoughts. I think the three of us on the panel have gone through pretty much the similar kind of literature review when it comes to ASEAN centrality, and we have references to your writings too, Melly, on the different dimensions and so on. And so I think in the time that I have, I'd like to link the points I'd like to make to those that have been raised by both Pak Rizal and Sarah before me. I think we're all pretty much talking along the same lines, although from maybe slightly different perspectives about the three dimensions of ASEAN centrality. We've been talking about the internal dimension, where member states are really internalizing what are their commitments to ASEAN, being serious about the commitments that they have made regionally, and going back and implementing them at the national level. So there's that internal dimension of ASEAN centrality, whether it's present or not. And then both Pak Rizal and Sarah have also talked about that external dimension of ASEAN centrality, whether ASEAN's external interlocutors, the dialogue partners, also have this kind of internalization or the acceptance and awareness of ASEAN as the quote-unquote primary driving force, as it were. I remember Dr. Surin highlighting this word very much, so this term very much, that ASEAN being central is the driving force. Then, of course, the third dimension of ASEAN centrality lies in that institutional aspect that the two previous speakers have also highlighted about, the acceptance of ASEAN's role, the role of ASEAN institutions as well. And here, of course, we are not just looking at ASEAN in the collective, but also the different institutions and mandate, the ASEAN chair, which rotates every year, but still asserts a certain form of leadership around which the different member states also try to rally. Then there is the coordinating role of the ASEAN Secretariat, and then the increasing mandates that have been given to the ASEAN Secretary General, particularly in terms of coordinating humanitarian assistance and so on. I mean, that's also grown over the years. So there are these different dimensions of ASEAN centrality. My takeaway from all of this, my addition, I should probably say, to this discussion would be, first, ASEAN centrality, whether we discuss or not, it's obsolete or not, let's look at, I think ASEAN centrality is both present and absent. And why do I say that? It's because, we've been talking about this ASEAN centrality. It's there in all the ASEAN statements and so on, the declaration. So it's been very present and prominent in that sense in all the declarations and statements made by ASEAN, as well as, by the dialogue partners of ASEAN. But it's absent in the sense that acceptance of this central role does seem to be absent. If I go back to the findings of the 2023 State of Southeast Asia survey that the ASEAN Studies Center at ICIS conducts annually since 2019, I was part of the team that started that survey. This year's findings revealed that over 80% of regional respondents are concerned about ASEAN being slow and ineffective, being unable to cope with political and economic developments. Over 70% were concerned that ASEAN is becoming an arena for major power competition. and over 60% were worried about ASEAN's disunity. So there is this, I think, recognition or realization that despite the statements and declarations about ASEAN centrality, the presence in that performative sense, or I think the descriptive sense that Pak Rizal mentioned, is also absent in the acceptance. So this paradox of centrality being both present and absent, if I look at it through the lens of ASEAN's efforts to try and bring about a settlement to the political crisis that has erupted in Myanmar following the 2021 military coup, we can see that the ASEAN Chair statement that was issued a day after the coup on the 2nd of February 2021, it underscored the importance of adhering to the principles and purposes of the ASEAN Charter. But we've also seen the Myanmar military choosing to ignore ASEAN's efforts and exhortations, and instead resorting or asserting to its own narrow interpretation of ASEAN Charter principles, even going as far as to challenge the legality of ASEAN's decision when in October 2021, ASEAN decided under Brunei's chairmanship to invite only a non-political representative from Myanmar to the ASEAN summits. And in the early months of Cambodia's chairmanship in 2022, that non-political representative criterion was expanded to the foreign ministers' meetings. So that's the first point about being present and absent. It's the gap. This brings me to the second point, the gap between the assertion of ASEAN centrality and the acceptance of ASEAN centrality, whether we're talking about individual member states or among the different external partners. Since what I'm going to be talking about really relates to ASEAN's response to the Myanmar crisis, let's look at it through that lens. So before that October 2021 decision about Myanmar's representation at ASEAN summits, there was the 5-point consensus that the 9 ASEAN heads of state and government negotiated with coup leader and chair of the State Administration Council military regime, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, back in April 2021. And ASEAN has been seeking very hard to implement the 5-point consensus's priorities. Now, if we look at the 5-point consensus as a broad policy framework, again, these priorities include cessation of violence, constructive dialogue among all parties concerned, appointment of a special envoy to mediate the dialogue, and the special envoy is also supposed to meet with all parties concerned, and ASEAN to coordinate humanitarian assistance. And all of that requires this acceptance of ASEAN's assertion of its central role by the member states as well as in the member state concerned, which in this case is Myanmar. But what we've seen since 2021, of course, is the State Administration Council conflating the 5-point consensus implementation with its own 5-point roadmap, indicating that it would address the 5-point consensus only after the situation in Myanmar returns to stability. But of course, the main point of the 5-point consensus was to get to that state of stability by calling for cessation of violence. So I think the reluctance of the State Administration Council to accept ASEAN's attempts at constructive intervention towards restoring stability in Myanmar shows up that gap, between the performative and the stated realities of asserting ASEAN centrality. And we also see these gaps in the divergence of views among the ASEAN member states regarding ASEAN's overall approach to the Myanmar crisis. We can say that, whether it's domestic challenges competing for attention with the need for this concerted regional response to the Myanmar crisis, or whether those, more specific concerns in neighboring countries over the humanitarian and security implications of the spiraling situation in Myanmar spilling over across borders. All of these, we can say, yes, they can be factors why there has been less acceptance or, leading to that bifurcation of views, as you mentioned, Melly, in your opening remarks. And this is notwithstanding the dialogue partners' expressions of support for ASEAN's lead role in addressing the Myanmar crisis. So we also need to look at how the external partners are looking at ASEAN centrality. Is it also performative, descriptive, or whether they are more substantive follow-ups to their expressions of support? But I'd also echo Pak Rizal and Sarah's observations in my final point about there really is no alternative to ASEAN centrality. I mean, you know, all these different arrangements that come out, maybe the discussion of whether bilateral arrangements, flexible sub-regional mechanisms or efforts can be part of an interpretation of ASEAN centrality or ASEAN's role. I think, you know, we've talked about ASEAN being caught between the strategic power competition and though preferring not to choose, and the pragmatic acceptance of China's presence in the region. I think the State of Southeast Asia surveys do show that Southeast Asians are concerned. And if forced to choose, I think respondents to the State of Southeast Asia survey, 2/3 of them have opted that they will choose the US if ASEAN were forced to choose. But we also need to look at country level responses. Responses from Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia seem to favor choosing China over the US. But Rizal, sorry, I'm not talking about you per se. But you know, this is what the survey findings have shown. And of course, despite commitments to ASEAN centrality, I think member states still overwhelmingly focus on national interests rather than that first dimension of ASEAN centrality, which is trying to align national and regional interests or taking the regional commitments and implementing them back at the national level. And of course, regarding the Myanmar crisis, the differing views that we've seen on ASEAN's next moves also show an ambivalence to ASEAN's central role. 1/3 of the regional responses, mainly from past and incoming ASEAN chair countries such as Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos, expressed neutral views about the 5-point consensus. And on the one hand, Singapore respondents have viewed the 5-point consensus's lack of progress as largely due to the State Administration Council's intransigence, but responses from Myanmar view the 5-point consensus as quote-unquote fundamentally flawed. So, you know, there are these different, I think, views regarding ASEAN centrality, ASEAN central role. But regionally, however, there still is that broad agreement that ASEAN should engage in independent dialogue with all key stakeholders to build trust in Myanmar. And this sentiment, I think, reinforces somewhat this refrain that we've also heard repeated today: there is no alternative for ASEAN but to consciously and proactively, I think, strive to earn its central role. So if anything, the Myanmar crisis again presents this timely call for the infusion of new ideas and creative approaches, and to, I think, give effect to ASEAN's intent to strengthen its institutional capacity and effectiveness. So I'll end here. I think that's where we stand. It's both present and absent, but there are gaps between the assertion of and acceptance of ASEAN centrality. But at the end of the day, I think all three of us have also mentioned that if we are seeking alternatives, what alternatives are there to ASEAN centrality? So it is upon us to, I think, really step up and earn it. I'll stop here, and I apologize if I've gone over time.
Thank you, Mo, for ending on what needs to be done, which we can, of course, tease out in a bit. So very good start, all three speakers. Thank you. We are now going to go into the question and answer session. We'll give enough time for our audience to write in their questions and put it in the Q&A box. I encourage you to do so. And if you would also like to, for those who are entering their questions in the Q&A box, to indicate who you are directing the question to who of the three speakers you're directing the question to. But just to sort of kickstart the Q&A session, let me raise a question. I want to all, right? Starting perhaps with our first speaker, Rizal. It's really, I think generally, this thing about credibility the ability to be able to not just say we are central, but to have the ability to do so, right, has been one of the critique of ASEAN. You know, they like to think that they are central. A lot of dialogue partners say we abide by or respect ASEAN centrality, but when it comes to performance, this really is the nub of the problem. So would it help perhaps if there has to be more discussion, serious discussion, and really looking at the institutional design of ASEAN? Because it seems to me, at least, you know, that it is really the institutional design that constrains ASEAN from doing a lot more than they should be doing. Or is it really something else? So to all, you know, maybe whoever can start, but let me invite Rizal, because you talk a lot about, you know, this the thing about the charter and the modalities of ASEAN. So is this really a major problem, issue that has to be addressed, or is it something else? So I invite all our speakers to respond to that. Rizal? Yeah.
Oh, well, yes, thank you, Meli. No, I think, you know, we know that, you know, ASEAN just, I mean, not just, like 2 years ago already set up a new high-level task force, you know, to basically address these questions. So they basically want to do the strengthening of the ASEAN capacity and institutional effectiveness, right? That's the heading of the main task of this high-level task force. And then they already submitted the result of their works, you know, to the summit in Cambodia November last year. But of course, you know, if you read the outcomes of their deliberations among the high-level task force, you know, still short of the things that we really want to see in order for ASEAN, you know, to, I think, move forward and then make it, you know, more capable, more agile, you know, in responding to all the challenges that we face. So we have been discussing this probably, you know, more than like 20 years. Even, you know, at the beginning of the process of drafting the ASEAN Charter, we already talked about this decision-making process issue. We talk about the funding mechanism. We talk about the role of the organs, the authority of all the ASEAN organs, and so on and so on. And today, we're still talking about those issues, which, you know, really suggests very clearly that ASEAN has not really moved very far from where it was, you know, right after the end of the Cold War. So that's why, you know, I do think that, you know, we need to keep pushing, that they need to change, you know, some of this, especially on one particular issue that we learned become the obstruction, you know, since the coup in Myanmar, which is the inability or the absence of mechanism within ASEAN to respond to a crisis that happened in one member state. So that's, you know, I think something that missing in the ASEAN Charter. ASEAN Charter doesn't have that. It only says that if you have a problem, you cannot solve it, then, you know, refer it to the leaders. Then, of course, the leaders, they cannot solve it, refer back to the foreign minister. So they've been, you know, basically in that loop, you know, on and on and on. So that's, you know, I think, in short, yes, you know, we need to really look at all those institutions within ASEAN, the mechanism of decision making and others, then, you know, try to come up with ways on how to push it forward, how to make all the ASEAN member states agree and then see the importance of changing of those rules.
Yeah, Sarah, can I invite you to comment? Is it more really institutional deficiency into the design flaw of ASEAN?
Thanks, Melly. Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, like what Rizal says, I think we are missing that dimension of crisis, I guess, management or resolution, right? But I would also say that ASEAN's institutional design, I think, is really a collective function of the preferences of all 10 ASEAN member states. And the question to me is really, if we are looking at changing the institutional design, then what kind of design would be ideal or would be acceptable to all 10 and soon to be 11 countries? And my final point to this is really that I think if we look at ASEAN today, I mean, ASEAN has already built up a wealth of tools, agreements, commitments over the past several decades, right? So perhaps we could start by you could start looking at it there, right, in terms of what do we have that we are not utilizing effectively, and then we can then start to build on what already exists. But ultimately, I think it boils down, I think, to political will from each of the 10 ASEAN member states. Because without that political will or that drive to push through change, I think ASEAN will find itself kind of stuck in this cycle or in this endless loop.
Thank you. And Mo?
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to the very important and relevant point that Sarah highlighted. Really, it is, Sarah mentioned that it is a collective function of all ASEAN member states. And here, I think we really need to, remind ourselves that ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. So when we're talking about that collective function, it is also, that something that is discussed and negotiated between and among the governments that represent the ASEAN member states, and that's where Sarah's point about political will also comes in. I think it's in the years I've spent at the ASEAN Secretariat, I've also seen this. It's really how countries then go back, as I mentioned, go back and implement what they have agreed to regionally. So most of us, most of the people who look at ASEAN see the declarations, the statements, the announcements that are made at important meetings, and then they say, okay, this is ASEAN's decision. But really, that decision made at the regional level has to be given effect by a patchwork of national level or bilateral agreements, even for something that we mostly take for granted these days, which is visa-free travel among the different ASEAN member states for nationals, for citizens of ASEAN member states. So I think it's that thing. We need to really look at how ASEAN's current intergovernmental setup actually helps or hampers it. And Sarah's put it really well. It boils down to political will. So then what is political will? It is national interest. And then what constitutes national interest? Is it political survival interests of the people who are in the seat of power? Or is it something else that's related to the security perceptions and the existential intentions of member states and so on? So I think that's where I think the crux of it is. Again, I would go back to the internalization, the internal dimension of ASEAN centrality. To what extent are we giving effect to the regional commitments that we sign on to nationally?
Thank you. We have a number of questions that have been entered in our Q&A slot, so I'll try to cluster them, and also already my apologies if we are not able to cover all, because I look at the time and we have barely less than an hour. But this is an interesting question, just to sort of flesh it out further, this whole notion of centrality. It's an anonymous question. It says, do you think there is a variation of significance or effectiveness of centrality among the 3 ASEAN communities? In other words, is in terms of economic security or sociocultural economic community or social, do you think the centrality is more meaningful in some of these areas or not? So maybe Mo, you since you're with the Secretariat before, can you quickly answer that before I turn to the others? Over to you, Mo.
Yeah, I was looking at that question too. It's really interesting because that centrality of ASEAN's decisions and what I was talking about, countries going back and implementing it in the ASEAN Economic Community context, we see that as countries going back, changing their rules and regulations, enacting laws to facilitate that the free flow of goods and services, and the thinking of customs, labeling and designations and so on. So we see that in the economic community quite visibly, and we've also seen in the context of the ASEAN Economic Community, this willingness by member states who are not quite ready to buy some time, to ask for some time to get their their national arrangements sorted out, meanwhile allowing what is progressing at the regional level to go ahead. So, I'm referring to that ASEAN minus X formula. We've seen that I think at more in the ASEAN Economic Community area, where there are these there is a naming and shaming kind of a checklist of who has complied with the ASEAN agreements and or not, you see. So we see that, I think, more visibly and more concretely when it comes to the economic integration arrangements. The social cultural community, and I was in the division that was coordinating social cultural community priorities, particularly human development. There, I think the softer approach is really in trying to build more communities of capacity, where when member states discuss a certain topic and capacities or knowledge or information is found to be lacking or missing, then member states step up to share that capacity, that information, exchange ideas, and so on, and thereby build those communities of capacity around a central objective, again, which is a priority that ASEAN identifies at the regional level.
Okay.
So that's how we see it. Political and security, perhaps I should leave it for Sarah and Pak Rizal to comment upon.
Okay, so we have, in fact, a number of questions on political security, but there's this one directed to both Sarah and Rizal. Rizal, you have a lot of questions, but let me take this question for you and Sarah first. With the recent efforts, this is again the threat of multilateralism. So with the recent efforts by Japan, South Korea, and the US to step up defense cooperation, along with the formation of AUKUS and QUAD, are we seeing extra regional powers setting up institutions to bypass ASEAN's centrality in the event of a conflict with China? So I just shortened that. And I think this is conflict in the event of conflict with China. And maybe also in that regard, it's a spin-off to Sarah. Another question to you, Sarah. How can you highlight the power structure with it present between ASEAN and China? Maybe Sarah, you can integrate that when you respond to this question. All right. So who wants to go first? Sarah, and then Rizal.
Can I just go first, very quickly, and then
okay.
later on, probably Sarah can answer. Yeah, give you a longer answer.
Okay, Rizal.
Well, it's depending, on what are these multilaterals objective, are. So I think look at, say, Japan, Korea, and the US. If this initiative can actually facilitate, much better relationship between Japan and South Korea, then ASEAN should be grateful for that. Because that's what has been, ASEAN trying, to push all along, through the engagement and so on. But on the other hand, if this is, I think, become part of this alliance building, then that also signifies the weaknesses of ASEAN, because ASEAN itself, cannot, prevent other countries, extra regional powers, from resorting to their own what they think, as a more appropriate response to the perceived challenges within their, strategic environment. While, at the same time, ASEAN is actually, after the end of the Cold War, is meant, to really address those kind of challenges. If ASEAN cannot actually address the challenges, then of course, other countries will try to find whatever, ways possible in order, to prepare themselves to respond to whatever they perceive as challenge. This is a wake-up call, for ASEAN to really, do more geopolitics, if you like. So ASEAN should not shy away from the importance of geopolitics. They must play, quote unquote, geopolitics. So that's, basically, my response to that, questions.
Yeah. Sarah?
Thanks, Melly, and thanks for the questions. I agree with Pak Rizal, I think, to some extent, that I don't think in that context, right, in the context of a conflict with China, the QUAD and other multilateral arrangements will bypass ASEAN centrality. Because I think in that context of a conflict with China, the multilateral arrangements and ASEAN, they actually serve quite different functions. And I don't think that conflict with China or a US-China conflict is meant to be prevented directly via ASEAN in any case. So in that sense, I think there's a bit of a different or complementary functions of the platforms. And I suppose it really goes back to the heart of what we mean when we talk about ASEAN centrality, right? And if we are referring to ASEAN centrality in the sense that ASEAN is still the main institutional convener in the region, then currently, I don't think that the QUAD or AUKUS has bypassed that function yet, right? So I think in that sense, ASEAN still has centrality. But of course, 10, 20 years down the road, things might change. We don't know, right? So that leads me to the second question on the power structures between ASEAN and China. So I'm going to address this question kind of broadly, right? So the power structures between ASEAN and dialogue partners as a whole. And I think ASEAN's power, I think as we know, is really normative, right? The sources of its power come from its networks, right? That it is the hub of regional multilateralism, that it is able to gather competing or marginalized countries to be at the same table. And that by engaging with ASEAN or by bringing ASEAN into regional decision-making, there is this sense of legitimacy in decision-making, right? Because now the smaller countries are included, or at least are given a voice when it comes to regional negotiations. So I think those are the sources of ASEAN's power. Whether those normative sources are sufficient to overcome the very raw material power gap that ASEAN has with some of the bigger dialogue partners, I think probably not. But that's where I think like the aspect of managing expectations would come into the picture, because then what do we expect out of ASEAN centrality, right? And what can ASEAN realistically achieve given the sources of power that it has? So I think that would probably require some unpacking.
Okay, thank you for that. There's a question for a number of questions for Rizal, so which very much relate to the current point about perhaps managing the need to really take seriously, face head-on geopolitics, and at the same time manage expectations. So the question to Rizal from another anonymous attendee is that if ASEAN is considered obsolete or unable to give benefit, I guess, to its member states in the face of geopolitical competition and crisis in the region, so what should Southeast Asia rely on? What do you think Southeast Asia must, or who or which? Rizal.
Well, remember, when the five countries agreed, to form ASEAN back in 1967. There were disagreements at the time with regard to the role of the foreign military bases and the nature of the alliance, military alliance relationship, between two prospective member states at the time. They agreed, basically, these are the preference and the sovereign choice of any member state, to make. So within that context, I don't see that, country must, so rely on only, ASEAN or only on military alliance in order to actually, safeguard, their national sovereignty and national security in a more traditional sense. So within that context, the ASEAN also serve not only this, geopolitical and geostrategic interest of member state. It doesn't only, function, to provide whatever answers that they're looking for in order to satisfy those, challenges. But there are also a lot of other functions. So I think we should not forget that one of the main and primary function of ASEAN actually to ensure a good and peaceful relationship among the member states. So until today, I think the biggest and the most important achievement of the ASEAN is that none of the member states would ever think that they need to resort to war in order to resolve problems or differences among member states. So I think that it's already been achieved. Having said that, it doesn't mean that then you can just ditch ASEAN then we'll continue to have that condition. So it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be sustained, and then it needs to be safeguarded. So that's I think one important function and also achievement of ASEAN so far. But again, because of that success, that ASEAN now is expected, and then also in fact needed to play a much larger role beyond Southeast Asia. So that's why I think if you look at the charter and then you look at the Indo-Pacific outlook on Indo-Pacific, it clearly says the centrality means the place of ASEAN within the larger regional architecture beyond Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and I think more again about Indonesia. There's a question for you from Termsak, Pak Termsak. He says ASEAN centrality is a point I think that he wants the group to take note of, is applicable only in Southeast Asia, but not beyond our own region. I think that part of it is worth discussing. But the other part of his question really is that an important part, let me just continue. An important part of the ASEAN centrality is the individual commitment of each member states to give due importance to ASEAN commitments, right? Thus, ASEAN centrality is not obsolete, but widely misunderstood. So that's a comment there. But his question is, again, the role of Indonesia, and directed to you, Rizal. Indonesia seems to want to join BRICS. Does this mean that Indonesia has already chosen to take the Chinese side in the rivalry between China and the US? That's for you, Rizal. And let me see if I can, another question for related also to Indonesia's position. And will this decision of us, Indonesia's attitude or response towards ASEAN and its siding of the major power, will this be affected with will this change, or in the forthcoming election of Indonesia? Do you think that whatever is Indonesia's position now will continue post Jokowi's administration? So, Rizal, first to you, 2 questions.
Okay, thank you, Termsak. I think we need to read the charter again, and also the Indo-Pacific outlook, because it's really says that the centrality is not confined to ASEAN anymore only. So saying that that the centrality of ASEAN only central to ASEAN is like saying that Professor Meli Antony is central only to Professor Meli Antony. So I don't think that's how it's being framed by the drafters of the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific and also the ASEAN Charter. On BRIC, 2 points. First one, why joining BRICS automatically means that you already siding with with China. So I don't really understand the logic behind the questions. That Indonesia say even if we wanted to join BRICS, that it means that we already made decision that we will take the Chinese side in this US-China rivalry. That's number one. So India is there. Don't forget. I don't think that India being in the BRICS, then it means that India already decided that they will be joining China in the struggle via the United States. The second point, I don't think Indonesia ever stated that we wanted to join BRICS. In fact, the speculation was there after I think the Spectator Index came up with this list of countries that it says already applied to be a member of BRICS. Indonesia has never actually announced it that we were seeking the membership. And in fact, when the new members of the BRICS was announced, it's actually Indonesia was not on the list. Only all these four I think 2 Middle East countries, Iran and Ethiopia, and so on. So in that context, I don't think that Indonesia at this point see the benefit of joining the BRICS simply because of 2 reasons. Number one, it's hard to deny that there is this perception or impression already that BRICS, is being used, as part of the struggle in order, to create an alternative world order, by some members. And we're not interested in joining any group that is anti this and anti that. She will stay true, to our core values of our foreign policy, which is, the non-aligned and also the free and active policy. So, it's not true that we already joined BRIC. No, we do not join BRIC. Second, we don't see the real benefits. It is not, a real organization yet. It's basically a caucus. It's like MICTA and all other these international, institutions such as Goldman Sachs and so on came up with. So we had D8 in the past, and then of course, G77. So this has no structure that can really deliver real economic benefit, for any members who join. Not to mention that, I think BRIC is also suffers a very serious problem internally, with this diverse membership. The third point, the third question, I don't think that Indonesia's foreign policy will change much, regardless who's going to be the president, because I think every candidate now, and also I think even in the future, will continue to stick to this, free and active, foreign policy. So the question is that, which part of this, free and active will get more emphasis, because we can be, more free, probably less active, or sometimes, we become very active, but we're not sure whether we're really, free. But, what can tie Indonesia is really, this consensus among the elite and among the politicians that, we should not take side, within this rivalry, and we should not get dragged into this, rivalry between the US and China.
Thank you. There's a question here about the US and ASEAN. Who was it who said, despite all this exhortation, ASEAN is important, respect. But when the leader of the US, or President Biden, decides to skip the ASEAN summit, what does it say about the US and other dialogue partners' view on ASEAN centrality, as well as the importance of the bloc in the region? We all know that Biden is not coming, and it will be Vice President Kamala Harris who's coming to the summit. So who would like to take that question? Perhaps Mo, and then Sarah, if you also want to weigh in. Mo?
Thanks, Melly. Yeah, I think that's one of the points that really I think will highlight this notion of the external dimension of ASEAN centrality. I think I mentioned in the points I made about to what extent do our dialogue partners, the external interlocutors, also internalize or also accept and are aware of ASEAN as that primary driving force, the convening force, so to speak. And I think what President Biden has decided for this year brings back memories for ASEAN of what happened during President Bush Jr.'s administration, when during Laos's chairmanship year, I think President Bush designated his Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice as his representative, and for that, I think that was around 2004, and ASEAN member states at that time were also questioning, what is then the United States' interest in, commitment to ASEAN collectively, and what does that mean for ASEAN's central role? So I think that kind of memory will rise up again, and also occasion similar questions about the interest, particularly at a time when, of course, major power competition is sort of at its highest point. So again, this is where I think we need to look at this projection, this assertion of ASEAN centrality, much as we look at it, how much is accepted, or is it accepted, the extent to which it is accepted in each ASEAN member state. We also need to now consider to what extent is it also internalized and accepted among our different external partners.
Yeah. Sarah, you want to weigh in on this? Because that was one of the points you made earlier, that, regardless of its deficiencies or limitations, other partners of ASEAN and even dialogue partners or development partners still want to engage with with ASEAN attend their meetings, but when the US doesn't come, US president doesn't come to ASEAN summit, is that a significant setback? Yeah, Sarah? Yeah.
Thanks, Melly. So I think it is, the absence of President Biden, I think, is disappointing. But I guess we should also acknowledge that, in US foreign policy, I really don't think ASEAN is within the top 3 priorities for Washington, right? So that again goes back to the idea of managing expectations. And to ask kind of what kind of commitment can ASEAN expect from the dialogue partners? Because in the case of the US, it's trying to align, or I guess it's trying to support the AOIP, in every statement of the QUAD that comes out from the meetings. They reaffirm support for ASEAN centrality, ASEAN cohesion on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the presidents keeping out on the key ASEAN meetings of the year. And I think what is worrying is not just this one incident, but like Mo says, I think if you look across the board, if you take a longer view of the time period, I think we can see that there has been frequent downgrading of delegations from the US, right? So under George Bush, I think was one. Under former President Trump, there were also some instances, and then now under President Biden, right? And President Biden was supposed to, I suppose, reverse the Trump lack of engagement with the region. So if we look across the board at these different administrations, and if we look at how US delegations to ASEAN meetings have kind of been downgraded or they have skipped out on certain ASEAN summits, I think in the longer term, it doesn't reflect well on ASEAN's role in the regional order, right? Because it shows that there is very little, I think, that could entice or to attract the President of the United States to attend an ASEAN meeting. But that said, I think we also should look beyond the presence and also at the concrete or the substantive engagement that the US has with the region. Because I think when we look at US support for ASEAN centrality, that substantive or that concrete commitments do factor in as well.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, Rizal. Yeah.
Well, I think, ASEAN needs to get used to 2 things, in managing regional politics. Number one, we need to get used to the idea that how to conduct or sustain centrality without unity among the member states. So that's, I think, one subject of debate or policy debate, if you like. The second one, we should go on managing whatever we can in regional, politics with or without the US. It means that, we need to understand that we need to understand US better. US is the superpower emeritus. Sometimes you see them around the campus, sometimes you don't. Sometimes, they come to teach, sometimes they don't. So, I think that understanding is on the table. So that's the way I think, to really look at the role of the US and then the role of ASEAN, in the years ahead.
Okay, so while we are at the question with the US, to counter some of what they call the charm offensive of China, the US has also, of course, initiated the IPEF. Now, how might that affect? There's a question here from Giant Menon. How might IPEF affect the centrality of ASEAN when not all members have been invited to join? Sarah, you want to respond to this?
Sure. Well, I don't have a very long response because I think, firstly, I'm not really an economic specialist. And also, as far as I understand, I think IPEF is still in the early stages of negotiations. So at this stage, I don't see IPEF as really kind of challenging ASEAN centrality yet. But of course, it really depends, I think, from what comes out of the negotiations and whether the commitments that it requires from its signatories clash with their commitments to ASEAN, I think, eventually.
Okay. There's a question about managing expectation, which has been raised several times by our speakers. But this is an interesting question from Where did I miss that? Okay, from Kan Lee. It says, what is centrality of ASEAN when no ASEAN nor ASEAN member country other than the Philippines had objected to China using water cannon to prevent the Philippines from resupplying at the second Thomas Shoal? If nobody stands up other than the Philippines, what is ASEAN centrality? Anyone wants to respond to this? Rizal?
Well, yeah, this is the point that I raised before, right? Basically, I think it's foolish, for a country to really think that, everything has to be, done and then expected, through or from ASEAN. So that's why, I think in addition to ASEAN, each member state or any other country for that matter is also free to pursue their own, strategy for their own national interest. That is very clear. So, for example, in dealing on, say, threat A and B, then ASEAN might be useful. Say, trafficking, and other transnational crimes. So this cooperation within ASEAN is really, really useful. When it comes to the traditional security, I think challenges, then of course, I have to say that some countries will find it like military alliance building, military build up probably more suitable for the challenge that they face as they perceive it. So within that context, international relation is not monolith, and it doesn't have to be. So ASEAN is only one of those platform or instruments available if you want to use it. So do not expect that ASEAN will deliver everything that what you need.
Okay, perhaps a related question to that, Rizal, and of course the Mo and Sar can come in. I mean, when in the case of the Philippines, some would argue that in the spirit of trying to uphold a rules-based order, even if you don't have to respond militarily, to provide military assistance, because that's not really the ASEAN way of doing things. But should there have been an ASEAN statement condemning these acts, aggressive acts by China, in the spirit of ASEAN solidarity?
If we expect that ASEAN will issue a statement that condemn, then probably that's not going to happen. There would be no consensus within ASEAN. But at least we can expect, I think it's quite reasonable expectation that ASEAN can issue expression of concern, calling for calm, and then also calls for restraint. That's, I think, the least possible course of response that ASEAN can come up with. So personally, I'm quite disappointed that until today I have not seen that sort of response to what's going on in the Ayungin case.
Yeah, Sarah, and then Mo.
I do agree. I think that it's reasonable to expect ASEAN to at least issue a statement to call for calm and restraint. And I was just wondering whether is it actually easier for ASEAN to issue statements about situations when it doesn't involve any of its member states? In the sense that if we look at areas like the Korean Peninsula, I mean, ASEAN has issued statements quite frequently, I believe. When I think when the Russia-Ukraine war happened, it took some time, but ASEAN eventually did. I think ASEAN did issue a statement, if I'm not wrong. So in that context, I mean, is it easier for ASEAN to comment or to issue statements when it doesn't actually involve its member states, because it is less, I guess it's a bit more distant from those conflicts. So I thought I would just raise this point.
Yeah, but it did issue a statement on Myanmar.
Myanmar,
so Mo,
yeah.
Yes, it did. Yes.
Yeah, Mo, yeah.
I think this all relates back to what we were talking about, this paradox of ASEAN being present and being absent. In the sense that, even with all the, I think the critical views that abound, it's still about what ASEAN should or could do better, or what ASEAN should do or could have done better, in that sense that it's still about ASEAN's role and ASEAN's voice. So I think it's very pertinent here to also look at situations where ASEAN is expected to at least say something. And when it doesn't say something, what does that mean for the country in question? Of course, I think for the Myanmar crisis, it was seen, I think, as a matter for regional security and concern. And the statements of concern have also escalated in, I think, the tone and the seriousness paid to it beyond, just an expressment, a statement of concern. So this really goes back to I think ASEAN being present in people's minds, and I think people also wanting to see ASEAN, I think, step up more to the plate. Let's not forget, though, during the Marawi siege, I know it's two different situations, but during the Marawi siege, there were individual ASEAN member countries offering assistance, military assistance, and other forms of assistance to the Philippines to address what was, a domestic matter of concern, but which nevertheless related to security. That could actually become a regional security issue. I do recognize that the two topics are different, but I'm just trying to bring up the fact that, ASEAN doesn't really kind of like leave a country to sort its issues out alone, but there are, I think, different approaches to how the regional response can be carried out. But that's very much, I think, something that member states try to discuss and carry out using the different channels of international relations and diplomacy that Barizal mentioned.
Yeah. Or could it also be, and this relates to one question, the reason why there's no immediate statement, or there's been disappointment on some member states that no statements have been released if it affects their security, is it because really due to ASEAN minus X mode of decision making, where there are difficulties in forging a consensus, and ASEAN really has to work on consensus? Can anyone respond to that? I'm sure people would really want to know, is this really one of the issues?
I think very quickly, Melly, we did talk about the ASEAN minus X being more visible and more practiced, practiced more in the economic integration context. But if we look at the different ways track 1.5 or track 2 diplomacy is carried out, I mean, these are also strategies and mechanisms and platforms that ASEAN has at its disposal to pursue what the the member states have been terming flexible engagement, for that matter. So the ASEAN way itself, I think, it's also built on this kind of flexibility of different approaches but towards the same objective. So I think we really need to look at also when we talk about centrality and that internalization, the commitment internally and domestically to ASEAN's central aim and objectives and priorities, it's how the different approaches are also, I guess, coordinated. Not so much that different approaches exist, because we do have sub-regional mechanisms in ASEAN as well that are formalized, that are institutionalized. But it's how these different approaches and different mechanisms also gel or are coordinated towards a central objective or priority.
Yeah. Anyone wants to weigh in on this consensus? Is this ever going to change? And is this really the problem why, there's a lack of action in ASEAN to issue statements that are critical or that is expected? I know, Rizal, you've been talking about this, so over to you. Yeah.
No, I think it's very difficult, because in order to get rid of consensus, you need a consensus. So that's I think a perennial problem. But at least this is the least that a lot of people expect. The chair issued a chair statement. So at least well, even though of course we know what that statement will look like, but at least the statement should be out there. Saying that look, we call for calm, we call for restraint, and then let's go back to the UNCLOS. That's the only reference that we all subscribe to in order to manage and address this kind of problem. So it's enough. So I think, but again, don't ask me why the chair has not come out there and then put all this kind of statement. Probably still busy in Johannesburg. I don't know.
Okay. Right. There is a question. Thank you, Raymond. This is your question for being so patient. Again, I think related to this big thing about how to manage expectation, how to get members to act together. the question that Raymond poses is, the problem with ASEAN is what sticks or carrots does the organization have to ensure that its members fall in line with its objectives, right? The EU has aid that could be withheld, for example. So what recourse does ASEAN have? Is there scope for ASEAN Court of Justice, noting that this shift in the EU formation's early days to give more powers to the ECJ resulted in member states foregoing sovereignty to a regional institution? And I guess for those who want to answer this question, there's a related one from Alden Lee, was intergovernmentalism is impediment to our institutional effectiveness. So maybe we can cluster them together. So can we use carrots and sticks to fall in line, get our members to fall in line? Let me call on Sarah first, and then and then maybe Rizal and Mo can come in after that. Sarah, yeah.
Thanks, Melly. And thanks for the questions. I mean, I think in the case of ASEAN, there are probably more carrots than sticks when it comes to making sure that its members fall in line with the objectives. But I mean, I don't think that ASEAN at this point is collectively ready to kind of go down the path of the EU. I mean, it goes back to what Mo was saying earlier as well about, if we look at ASEAN, it is still very much, and also what Eldon has brought up, right? It is still very much an intergovernmental organization, right? We are essentially talking about the interests and preferences of 10 very different ASEAN member states. So I don't think we are there yet. And I think that if there was a push towards a more supranational organization, I don't see ASEAN making much progress on it collectively. I think there will be some very strong counter pressures from within ASEAN itself. On whether intergovernmentalism is the impediment to our institutional effectiveness. Okay, so if we look at kind of the literature on institutionalization, right, then the answer is yes, right? Because ASEAN lacks very highly like rigid rules, highly institutionalized agreements, and so on. So in that sense, yes. But I think in the context of Southeast Asia or Asia generally, I would be a bit careful in saying that intergovernmentalism actually impedes institutional effectiveness, because it is a different context, and I think we should I guess we should approach ASEAN with the. Sorry, that did not come out well. But essentially, I think we should approach ASEAN as what it is, rather than what we hope for it to be. I mean, it's fine to have aspirations and ambitions, but I think we should be very clear-eyed on what the limitations and what the challenges to ASEAN's progress are.
Thank you for that. Anyone wants to weigh in? I mean, do you really need to have supranational structures to get your members to stay in line? Rizal?
No need. Look at EU. They cannot even, resolve this, conflict in Ukraine, and also Bosnia before. So that is, I think, unrelated, So I think it's really what sort of institutional design that we have. So this is really, even look at the ECOWAS, for example. They do have mechanism. They do have the institution, right? Even within that context, that they can respond, to the coup in one of the member states. Still, it's not easy to resolve the problem. So I think the design, of the institution itself also matters, not only about the nature of the organization as a whole, which is in ASEAN case, I don't even think that, it would ever change, from this intergovernmental, into supra type of regional, organization. So that's number one. Number two, I think I agree with Sarah that, ASEAN does have a lot of carrots. Yeah? So there's not much a stick. The only stick that we have is actually we can use, or ASEAN has used in the past, the diplomatic isolation, as a stick, to any member state that try to say breach the rules and agreement So, in that context, to what extent that, stick is effective or not is really, of course, a matter, of debate.
Okay. There's an interesting question here, and I think we should address this. How has ASEAN been acting as a buffer between the continuous tech competition between China and the US? How has it been acting as a buffer, or can it even be a buffer? Anyone wants to take that question? Sarah, you want to take a stab on this? Can you be a buffer between the continuous tech competition between China and the US? Or do we still have to manage expectation of what ASEAN can and cannot do?
I don't think ASEAN can be a buffer in the tech competition. I think that ASEAN can ASEAN can do what it does best, right? Try and get both parties to come to the table in a multilateral setting. But whether it can offer a buffer between China and the US to tamp down the technological competition, I don't think ASEAN has the capabilities to do that. But that said, I am not too familiar with the details of the technology competition, so I may have missed out some things there.
Well, I think we all actually more of a taker rather than the buffer, so, and that's, actually in line with our individual, interest. We think that, Huawei is good to address this digital gap within the country. And then I think, we will allow Huawei, to come in the country. That's what's happening, I think. So it's not so much about, being a buffer, in this tech, competition between the US and China. So because we don't have any leverage again.
But if we could sort of refine that or perhaps tweak it a bit, can ASEAN, with all its convening power, all its platforms that it provides, can it sort of buffer or not buffer perhaps is the wrong term, can it sort of help to manage relations between the US and China? Mo?
Whether it can or not, so that's, there are the different questions from whether it should try. So I think, even within the broader context, not only on, rivalry on tech, but also on the strategic rivalry as a whole, I think the convening power, of ASEAN need to be capitalized on, in order to facilitate that sort of, I think, say talk, and dialogue, between Beijing and Washington.
Thank you.
It's just a very quick way in. I agree with Pak Rizal. And I think sometimes the focus is really on, again, the very high level meetings, the photo op opportunities of ASEAN's convening power. But there are other mechanisms and so on. Of course, everybody looks at the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Plus summits, and make a gauge from there. But let's not forget, China's presence, China's attendance at ASEAN's high-level meetings like the summits, it's not Mr. Xi Jinping who attends, right? It's the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
So we need to be aware of that. But there are these different channels that ASEAN has at its disposal that ASEAN can exercise its convening power in different ways. And I think sometimes all of us, of course, we tend to look at what's out there splashed in the media at the very high level events, but the high level events are the final, the result or the culmination of a lot of negotiations, discussions, meetings at different levels where the work has been put in by many regional civil servants. And just a very quick two-finger kind of response to Raymond's question about ASEAN, EU, and this supranational notion. I am always reminded of Mr. Severino's, the late Mr. Severino's clarification on this point. EU came together by pooling sovereignty, whereas ASEAN's regional community building project is where member states are still holding on to their sovereignty. So I think that's something that I always remind myself, recalling Mr. Severino's remarks when it comes to comparing ASEAN and the EU.
Thanks for that, Mo. Very useful reminder to everyone all of us who study ASEAN. So we have about 1 minute. So over to you all, just to have your final thoughts on, again, is ASEAN centrality obsolete or not yet, or it depends? Let's start with Mo first.
Again, I would go back, to the point where as long as people are talking about ASEAN centrality, it's there. And so I think the concern or the imperative here is not to make it obsolete if we really want to invest in this regional community project and safeguard security for the region, and because of the regional security, then at different levels of the national security and progress. So that's my quick 5-second takeaway.
Thanks. Sarah?
Well, I think ASEAN centrality is not obsolete, or not completely obsolete, but for the longer term, it does need, the concept does need some rethinking. So I think definition is important. So what do we mean when we talk about ASEAN centrality? That's one. And the second thing that, or the final thing that I would say is really that, ASEAN can be, or can seek to be as central as it wants, right, in the regional order. But in a lot of cases, I think the events and developments are really out of ASEAN's direct control, right? So ASEAN can use the tools and the platforms that it has, but there also needs to be a recognition that the final outcome or the way things will play out may not necessarily align with what ASEAN wants. So that again goes back to my point about managing expectations as well.
And Rizal?
Well, if you really want to, maintain centrality, then, that remind me of Bilahari, used to say that, you must be relevant. And then in order to be relevant, you must be useful. And then in order to be useful, you must bring benefit, to everybody. Otherwise, you're not going to be, of course, central if you don't, deliver what you are seeking, to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, I don't think we have fully responded to the question. It's really, it depends on what you mean. And I come away, my takeaway rather for this meeting is it really has to, it's a question of how you actually manage expectation. ASEAN must still be central, because otherwise all these meetings that we have will not be attended by our external partners, and the rest of our ASEAN member states will not consider ASEAN any more important, right? So it must still be central. But nonetheless, the task for ASEAN to remain relevant is really a serious question that needs to be addressed, and I think that will continue to be a issue that will be examined and studied further by both the policy and the academic community. So it leaves me now to thank all of our 3 speakers, thank them for such a lively discussion, and of course to the Center on Asia and Globalization for allowing us to participate in this very interesting webinar. So we have now reached the conclusion of this webinar, and thank you again to all.